Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Courtney Edmond, and I am the owner of To Tame the Shame and of To Tame the Shame Parenting. And I have created this Stepstool model for supporting our neurodiverse kids. And it serves as the foundation for the parenting program in To Tame the Shame Parenting. And that's why it is so important for you to watch it, because everything that we talk about in To Tame the Shame Parenting and every strategy that we um, uh, advocate for and encourage you to use fits somewhere within this model. And if you can understand this model, which I promise you, it's not a complex model, it's very accessible. And it is informed by so much of my parenting and so much of the research that I've done to help my own child, who is twice exceptional, who is neurodiverse, and who I've had a long, challenging journey in figuring out how to support him to become his best self. And so, in sharing this model with you, I hope that you find nuggets of information and of connection and of understanding that will then allow you to move into acceptance and action in a similar way that I have. And I know that we're all coming at this from different perspectives, with different parenting approaches, but I hope that this can ground us in central understanding of who our kids are and what their basic overall needs and approach are, and why we need to become a different parent and use a different parenting manual, if you will, based on who our kids are compared to who other kids are. Like, I have two other kids. They don't need the same approach, specialized approach. The other parenting manuals that are out there have worked for them, but I definitely needed a different approach. And I continue to need a different approach in supporting my son. So, thank you for enduring this longer, I should say, webinar and informational session, and I hope that it benefits you. So, neurodiversity. What is neurodiversity? It's a buzzword term nowadays, but all that it means is that we perceive that people have brain differences, and those brain differences are normal. They are not deficits. These people who are neurodiverse do not need to be fixed. It's really about us understanding the way that they see the world, because the way that they see and they interact with the world and interpret the world might be different from ours, but it doesn't make it wrong. And by approaching the people who are neurodiverse in this way, we can reduce the stigma around these invisible learning disabilities, around these different brain-based differences, right? And so that's part of the mission of To Tame the Shame, is to get rid of the blame and shame game that so many of our kids endure, and to really help them understand that they have brain-based differences that require a different approach, that require some explicit skill building around the skills that they don't yet have. And that's the premise of neurodiversity. So hopefully, in understanding this term, you'll have a better understanding of the challenges that your child has faced, because their brain is different, but they don't need to be fixed. Now, what are some of these neurodiverse? Who are some of these neurodiverse people, right? So they are people who have ADHD, who are autistic. They might have, or on the autism spectrum, they have sensory processing disorders and dysfunctions. They have dysgraphia, dyslexia. They might be twice exceptional. And if you're not familiar with that term, it means that they have two exceptionalities. One is that they have a brain-based learning disability, or ADHD, and the other is that they have high cognitive ability. So they are on both ends of the spectrum and of abilities, high achieving abilities, and then they have this disability that sometimes masks the ability that they have, and it creates all kinds of chaos and confusion in how to support a child because there are all these asynchronies that I'll get into in a little bit. And then anxiety is not necessarily specifically a brain-based disability, but it can get lumped into neurodiversity because a lot of times it occurs concurrently with a lot of these other diagnoses, and um, it can exacerbate the challenges that people who are neurodiverse face, because anxiety impacts the brain. It comes from the brain and it impacts the brain's ability to function optimally. And so I like to talk about anxiety within the concept of neurodiversity because it happens so frequently to show up in people who are neurodiverse. But I'm hopeful that over time, as we get as a society more and more familiar with how people who have these brain based differences perceive and interact with the world, that there will be less blame, less shame, there'll be greater understanding um, of 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 how they perceive the world and how we can interact with them, and there'll be more compassion and less shaming, and we will be able to decrease that anxiety that people who are neurodiverse the people who are neurodiverse will have less and less anxiety around not meeting expectations or not meeting the typical expectations and norms of society. The term neurodiversity, in fact, is based in stemmed from the term biodiversity, in that the world is filled with a very robust, wonderful, diverse animals, plants. There's just so much in the world that's different and contributes to an enriched world. And the same is true of people and their brains. And by having this breadth and depth of types of brains and the way that they are wired, we live in a much more enriched world with humans as well. So that's the basis of neurodiversity. And the take home message is well, before I get to the take home message, I guess what I'd like to say is one of the challenges that people who are neurodiverse have, and we as their parents have, is that there's no concrete, tangible evidence for this brain based difference, right? And the challenge is behavior is also stems from the brain, controlled by the brain. And so it's hard to tease out the behaviors and disabilities, right? And so we can't measure it easily. There's a lot of subjective measurements that neuropsychologists can do, which can help inform our understandings of people. But I think it's very challenging for us when you're looking at someone to know whether or not they have a brain-based disability that results in them seeing the world differently, interacting with the world differently, receiving information in a different way, and then being able to initiate and act upon that information. And so, and be in relationship with people. So this neurodiversity impacts the way in which people interact with the world, the way that they interact with others, the way that they take in information, because it's all the brain processing and initiating, processing, receiving, processing, and initiating. And because the brain relies on biological processes, chemical processes, electrical processes, and we can't see any of those processes happening, it makes it hard for us to understand them if we aren't the person who's experiencing them. So having some understanding, greater understanding of of people who are neurodiverse, it's really about having compassion and understanding. And so similar to my son, um, I, so similar to my son, um, just go back here. Sorry about this. Um, the journey that I've had with my son is that I made a lot of mistakes all the way up until, yesterday, right? But the good news is that you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and you can change the ending. And so the good news about being here is that we together are learning this new parenting manual for our neurodiverse kids. And no matter what's happened in the past and the approaches that you've used in the past, by using and incorporating this new information that you're learning into Tame the Shame Parenting, you can start here and change the ending with your child. And that's exactly what's happened with my own son, also, I'm happy to report. So, I am changing the ending. We do have a wonderful relationship as I've learned how his brain operates and what he needs, what skills he doesn't yet have, and how I've come to appreciate how he interacts with and perceives the world now in new ways. And just like my son is twice exceptional and neurodiverse, I thought it would be good for us to see some other familiar faces of people who are neurodiverse and have been in the world interacting with it and experiencing it in different ways. So some are more familiar than others, but I think what this slide likes to reinforce is that there are more people in this world who are doing amazing things and with their neurodiverse brains than we might be aware of. So just imagine that your child might be up here one day, right? With these famous faces. So when we think about the concept of neurodiversity and when we think about anybody, right, we all have our own abilities, and those abilities typically uh, are measured or are represented in our strengths. Not everybody has a disability per se, but everybody faces challenges. And so when talking about a person with who has a neurodiversity, a diagnosis of sorts, like ADHD or dyslexia, right? Those parts of their brain are labeled as a disability. And unfortunately, what happens is we get so focused on the disability itself that we forget that people who are neurodiverse have these strengths and they have these abilities because we get so hyper focused on how to support them and how to fix the disability that we forget that we need to focus in on their strengths. And this is partly where the stigma and the anxiety comes from, because these people who are neurodiverse feel bombarded and needed to fix because of their disability, and they're not celebrated for their strengths. And so this is an important slide, because in To Tame the Shame coaching, we focus so much on their strengths and we want to celebrate success, but we can't ignore that they also have challenges. I think we have to find the balance of celebrating strengths and recognizing kids for their strengths and giving them opportunity to live into their strengths while simultaneously working to support the challenges without making people feel like they need to be fixed. So I hope that makes sense to you. So Don Clifton asserted in his Strengths Finders that there are 34 strengths that people might have. Now, he has an assessment tool that allows people to understand what how they all are measured, like top first, the top through the 34th. Most people will get their top 3 or their top 5. But what he also asserted is that people who use their strengths every day are 6 times more likely to be engaged in what they're doing and 3 times more likely to have a higher quality of life. And so those pieces are significant. And that last slide, therefore, has significance because if kids are who have disabilities, learning disabilities, are being bombarded all the time and not allowed to focus on those disabilities and raise those challenges, work on those challenges. If they're not able to work on their strengths, imagine how miserable their life would be, right? We all like to work to our strengths. So I think it's just important to think about what are the strengths that my child has and how can I develop those and allow them to use them every single day, whether it's art or music or science or writing or dancing or athletics or um, being silly. Like it doesn't have to be an activity to be a strength. Those it could be being interested in politics, right? It could be speaking. There are so many different strengths. It can be being a compassionate person. It can be being a social person. So I think it's just making sure that we give our kids enough opportunity to focus on our strengths, and there are many of those that we can find to focus on. So just for a moment, I think it would be nice for you to pause and think about what are your child's strengths. Um, Maybe take a moment to jot those down. You can pause the video recording while you do that. And then it can't be denied that our kids have challenges, right? And if we have a growth mindset, which is so important to have, I think, for any individual, but for these individual, for our neurodiverse kids, and as parents of neurodiverse kids, right, having a growth mindset of how do I build the strengths, but also I do have challenges, and I want to accept that. And what are they? What are my child's biggest challenges? And what would my child say the biggest challenges are? Because part of being able to work on a challenge is accepting that challenge um, and understanding that that is a part of who I am. And that can lead to then being willing to accept and use help. So, what are your challenges as a parent? What are your child's challenges that they need help with? And so, Don Clifton had 34 strengths. And the challenges that kids who are neurodiverse face are quite numerous also. These are just a few of them that uh, didn't have enough room to create room for any more. But so frequently they have social challenges, they have academic challenges, they have cognitive challenges, they have behavioral challenges, they have communication challenges. Um, and there are so many of them that can all be wrapped up into one, and we can mistake them for others. And it just gets so hard to be them. They are faced with, you know, the full day of school of challenges. Then they come home and they have challenges, and these kids just want to feel successful. Um, and so it can be this vicious cycle of one challenge after the next, after the next, after the next, and they become, no wonder anxiety is such a part of many of their profiles. And so when strengths meet the challenges, most neurodiverse people just can have these explosions of frustration, this experience of shame, because their challenges overwhelm most often their strengths, and it's really hard to be them because they can become defensive, and they can build up this armor. Depending on how, it starts pretty young, but they can build up this armor that is a self-protective mechanism, and they can develop these behaviors that is that armor, right? They become stubborn, and they lie, they are anxious, they're depressed, they become angry, and they refuse to do things. They feel things really intensely. So it can be very challenging as a parent to have a child who's neurodiverse because of the way in which these strengths and these challenges interact, because these kids typically know that they have these strengths, they're not able to express them. They don't understand why they can't express them and why they're always trying to be worked on the challenges, and told that they're not ever meeting expectations. And so imagine if your boss told you you were never doing what you were supposed to be doing, even though you were working really hard, how challenging that might be. And what might you do to preserve your own sense of self? And that's sort of what happens with our kids a lot of times. And so but what makes it even more complicated and why it's even harder to discern and detect is because, you know, every child has a certain profile of strengths and every child has a certain profile of challenges. And dare I say, no child profile is the same, right? And so someone with ADHD has these challenges, but they have these strengths. And so when you put them together, you get a certain shade of green. But then you have someone who has dyslexia, and then they have these strengths, and you put those together, and that's a completely different shade of green. And then you have somebody else, um, who has ADHD, who has a whole different set of strengths, and the way that their ADHD manifests and presents itself is different. And so you get a whole different shade of green. And so, and then you add in autism, and you add in dyslexia, you add in dysgraphia, you add in ADHD and anxiety, and you get the picture. There are so many different shades of green. And so the way that neurodiversity presents there can be so many ways that neurodiversity presents itself, and the way that we need to approach it is very individualized. And that's why to tame the shame coaching is very strengths based but individualized, because there's no curriculum that can, coaching curriculum that's going to meet the needs of each individual neurodiverse person. We have to tailor it to who they are, what their strengths are, what their interests are, and what their challenges are, and build the skills of the challenges while we tap into the strengths that they have. But you can see why the world of neurodiversity is truly diverse, because there's not one shade of green. Once you've met one twice exceptional person, or you met one person with ADHD, there are so many different flavors of that same diagnoses that it's sometimes hard to pinpoint exactly what it looks like. Now, the reason that I share this slide is because sometimes in a world that's focused on challenges, we can see the challenges only, right? And those challenges are so dominant that it hides the strengths, right? So their disabilities masks their gifts. In some instances, however, people have so many strengths and their disabilities are a little bit more mild, or they expectations and the need to and the strengths that the people have are so strong that it can overcome their disabilities because the expectations aren't yet too high. And so when a child typically is younger, their gifts may mask their disabilities. But as they get older and the expectations get higher, all of a sudden things shift and things get harder, and those disabilities start to come out a little bit more from behind the mask of the gifts. And sometimes, they sort of live side by side with one another, and we think that someone's quite average. But what can happen because of this masking is that we can call someone out for a disability, but the disability is such that we dummy down the information and the expectations, and the kid disengages because they're like, why am I being like, why do people think I'm stupid? And so they disengage. And so on the flip side, a person can have their gifts or their strengths mask their disabilities, and the person can't do the task, can't meet the expectation, because the disability is limiting their ability to use their strengths. And so what happens is they get stuck, and people say, well, why don't you try harder? Why are you so lazy? If only you were motivated. You know you can do this. You should be able to do this. You're smart enough. And so that's where that masking takes place and causes a problem. And sometimes these kids in the middle just kind of coast along and are average, but they're never really, they don't necessarily have they are not perceived as having a disability, but they're also not seen as having tremendous strengths. And what happens is they just kind of coast along, but they underperform. When they finally find their strengths, or their interests, they may perform at a high level, but their disability may limit them to a certain degree. So that's why I included this slide. And so a lot of these unsolved neurodiversity can lead to a lot of these unsolved problems and maladaptive behaviors, right? Because that masking situation, we can have so many kids who are misunderstood. They are seen for deficits. They know they should be able to be competent in something. They aren't competent. They get frustrated. Other people get frustrated with them. There are a lot of unmet expectations or unsolved problems. There's a concept of asynchrony in people who are neurodiverse, that the strengths would allow a person to perform at a really high level in certain things that they have strengths in, but the disability limits their ability to perform at that level, that cognitive level, that intellectual level that they could be able to perform at. And that asynchrony creates frustration and creates confusion, creates misunderstandings. And that's where that gap in that asynchrony between the strengths and the challenges is what results in these unsolved problems, in these unmet in these unmet expectations. And when the right parenting approach is not taken, when the right solutions and support are not put in place, it leads to these maladaptive behaviors. That is that armor that I talked about, that people put up to protect their sense of self. But sometimes it leads to some societal challenges and some individual health challenges, and substance abuse and self-harm, destructive behavior towards others. And hopefully we can, when those maladaptive behaviors that are more individually based are seen, those are red flags for getting curious about what's going on with this person and providing some compassionate support and seeing if there is an invisible brain-based disability that's impacting the child's ability to perform at a level that they want to be able to perform, that they feel like they should be able to perform, and assuming positive intent and presuming that they are competent and that they just need help in learning some skills that they don't yet have, is the most important thing that we can do to support these kids, to get curious, to be compassionate, to respond in a calm way. And if they aren't responding in a way with the ordinary parenting approach, presume that it's a brain-based disability that you don't know yet what it is, or you don't know enough about how to approach it, and get help, right? And that can be in the form of a neuropsychologist who can help out, or a school psychologist that can do some testing. So, or a coach that can just be with you as an ally to help you in this compassionate approach that the child needs. So if you remember back to the slide before, in which the strengths and the challenges come together, the yellow strengths and the blue challenges, which was a representation done by Susan Baum of the Bridges Academy. At any rate, she created that model of strengths and challenges in twice exceptional kids. So when they come together, it forms green. And unfortunately, our kids have a really rough time because they're misunderstood, and it's an invisible disability that looks like it's behavioral, and motivational, but it's not. And it's just certainly not easy being green. But as you know, and as I well know, it's not easy being a parent of these kids with neurodiversity, these neurodiverse kids, because we as parents are given a parenting manual for kids who are not diverse, neurodiverse. And so it's hard for us, but it's even harder for our kids who are green. And so the major takeaway is that neurodiverse learners can excel in their areas of strength as they develop the resilience, and by doing so, they develop the resiliency they need to persevere through the struggles of overcoming the challenges of their disabilities. And that was written by Beverly Trail in one of her fabulous books about twice exceptional gifted children. So if you remember back when I asked you to take some time to write down what your child's strengths are, um, there's a reason for that, because knowing what their strengths are and seeing them for their strengths every day is super important. And so, if we're thinking about our kids, they have complex needs. That's what makes parenting them so challenging. Their cognitive needs, academic needs, social emotional needs are a part of the picture, and they all might be in different places. Um, that's where this asynchronous development plays in, because their social skills may be at a different level than their academic needs, may be at a different level than their cognitive needs. And that's what makes this kind of a biopsychosocial um, um, requires a biopsychosocial approach, because we have to take in the biological factors, the psychological factors, as well as the social factors. And we need to make sure we have to understand the social piece. Some of these kids who are neurodiverse are going to feel things really intensely. They're going to be really overly excited, and their emotions may get in the way of our ability to relate to them. And so when we see these big emotions, we have to remember that sometimes it's the brain that's involved, right? And I'll get into that a little bit more in one of the sections about the whole brain child, about how these how our brains can just be hijacked. We don't see it. We just think it's behavioral and motivational, but in fact, it's all about the different parts of the brain integrating with one another, and the need for, and the inability of our kids in that moment to integrate their own brains. And that's just part of maturation, but it's also can be part of a disability. And so for people that are neurodiverse, it really can require a large team. Um, and sometimes the team um, will need to be larger than others, right? Depending on the diagnoses of the child and the complex needs of the child. But it also can, it demonstrates that this is a biopsychosocial um, profile, right? So we need to obviously have the child to be involved, the parent to be involved, teachers, possibly special educators. There might be a need for tutors, an executive function coach, a parent coach. There might be mental health needs and providers involved, and then medical needs or other allied health providers. Sometimes an occupational therapist might need to be involved, a speech pathologist, and who knows what other complex medical team members might be needed. But it's important to recognize that there are people who can help, and you may be one of the first people to talk about their need for support and a different parent plan. You might be the one who says, I need someone to be compassionate. This is not behavioral. This is about underlying skills that they don't have, that's a result of an invisible brain-based disability. I know it's a mouthful, but if you can remember all of those words all together, it will be a great tool for you in meetings at the school, in meetings with doctors, and meetings with psychologists, because we really need to get the word out that these people that have neurodiverse brains and interact with one another, it's a result of lagging skills that is directly related to their invisible brain-based disability. So I offer you that to take with you. And so we're finally getting to my step stool, right? So we've got the background information. We understand why we need a full team. We understand why it's biopsychosocial. But where do we go from here and how do we help? So the stool is based on a foundation of acceptance. I don't think that this will come as a surprise to you. Acceptance, patience, safety, and trust. Now, I know that sounds like it's really impossible to do as a parent when you're trying to get out the door and put dinner on the table and get to practice and get dishes done and let's go to school, or, there's so many things we have to do. But when we can, and we'll talk more about this in the rest of the parenting program, in particular, like I talked about in Whole Brain Child, where we have to integrate the brain. And in order for the kids to integrate their brains, we have to support them in doing that. And that requires acceptance, it requires calm, it requires patience, it requires safety and trust. Because just like in this community where we want to have safety and trust and acceptance, our kids want that too. And when we can presume competence, and when we can presume that the kids want to do well, like Ross Greene says in his book, The Explosive Child, when we can presume that they want to do well and they don't want to make us upset, that allows for them to be more honest with us. And the sooner we can do that in their lives, the less thick that armor will be of protecting their self-esteem, of the lying, of the challenging behaviors, and the maladaptive behaviors. So creating this place where there's safety, trust, acceptance, and patience is essential. And it's the foundation of everything. And from there, we build up the skills, right? We identify what their interests are. We nurture their strengths. We embrace their strengths. We understand their talents. But then we're also going to understand what their challenges are, and we're going to provide ways to support them, whether it's a cognitive challenge, an academic challenge, or another lagging skill like a social skill or executive function skill. And then we have to rebuild their self-esteem, and we have to strengthen their interpersonal skills, like how to communicate, how to be independent, right? And then we also have to strengthen their interpersonal skills. So advocating for themselves, we have to help them become self-determined. We have to help them do things for themselves. And when we can put all of these pieces together, and it can take time, believe me, I've been working on it with my son for now 4 years, and we're still not yet completely there, but he's getting there bit by bit by bit. We're putting these different pieces in place and building up and up and up until he's going to have complete growth and success. And I trust that that's going to happen. Now, if one of these things is in place, and y'all had a sneak preview a little bit earlier because I put my hand down and it tapped force, but if one of these pieces is not in place, it's a three-pronged step stool for a reason. If one of them's not in place, it's going to crumble, right? And when that crumbles, we don't want to let everything be lost. And not all of it has to fall. There can be parts of it that fall. But the point of it is that it's important for all of those pieces to be in place in order for the growth and success to happen. So let's go back and start over with a fully built model of growth, how growth and success happens. And we can talk a little bit more about the safety and trust, right? We have to minimize and eliminate the blame and shame. We have to validate and engage their strengths, meet them where they are, discover who they are, get curious, provide them with hope, and model patience. And this is the stuff that will continue to break through that armor, right? And it requires time to connecting with our kids in safe and trusting ways where we're just having fun. What are we doing that's meaningful to them instead of always expecting them to do things that are meaningful for us? And so then we can start to build skills once we've established that safe trust and accepting patient place, right? So, what kinds of strength in intrapersonal and interpersonal skills are we going to work on? Well, we're going to develop some self awareness. They have to start to become aware of what their own strengths and challenges are, right? And how those impact their ability to function in the world. We have to continue to break down that armor and build up their self esteem from the inside out. So we're chipping away it from the outside, but we're also helping to build it up so that it bursts off of them if their self esteem can get bigger, right? We have to help them understand that perfectionism is not their friend, right? That being afraid of failure is harmful and doesn't allow them to experience things. Um, and then help them to set some goals so that they can begin to see what the obstacles are, have a vision for their future. Sometimes these kids who are neurodiverse, they live in the present. And so we try to help them have a vision of the future. And then we need to help them identify, develop their interests. We have to nurture their strengths and their talents. And there's this concept of teaching to intellectual readiness. Um, so when a child is ready to learn something, we need to give them that. And if they're not yet ready for it, it they won't be able to grasp it in the same way. So we have to figure out what is their readiness, right? Is it too hard? It's like the Goldilocks thing. We don't want it to be too hard. We don't want it to be too easy. We want it to be just right. For them, most of the time, it needs to be relevant, right? And that's where understanding what their strengths are, because if we can teach things to them within the concept of their strengths, um, that can also be a way to go about helping them learn. Um, we can also develop their strengths and their interests and their talents. Like if they want to develop some social skills, maybe we do it in the context of something that they enjoy doing. Maybe they enjoy history. Well, let's take them to a museum and connect them with mentors at a museum to see what they might be interested, to see if they could develop some social skills with people who are also interested in history. And we can also just identify other places to plug them in so that maybe they're around kids who are similar to them. Um, and just providing some opportunities for them to enrich their lives in their own interests, strengths, and talents area. Mentorships, internships, making sure that we are advocating for them to have opportunities to learn things that make them happy, give them joy. And simultaneously, we have to advocate for them to develop their lagging skills, right? And get support for whatever their lagging skills might be. Um, and this might be harder to get them to engage in, but it's equally as important because when they don't yet have the skills that they need to perform at the level that they know that they could, um, they are going to get frustrated and continue to feel like failures. So it's important to get people on board who understand this approach that requires the recognition of the strengths, the compassion, the patience, the trust, the safety, the problem solving together, and who also can provide a toolbox in which to provide them with all of the skills that they need, whether it's academic, social, executive function skills, um, cognitive skills, reading skills, math skills, whatever the skills are that they're lacking, finding the supports that they need in order to build those skills is important. And again, I talked a little bit about this before in terms of the self advocacy and the self efficacy. So, self efficacy is just being able to do what they say they're going to do independently, right? And one of the most important skills that our kids can learn is that it's okay to ask for help and to empower them how to do that because they many times don't have the skill to know how to do that and to understand that it's okay. They don't have to have all the answers and it's okay to ask for help. So empowering them with these self advocacy skills and the ability to ask for help and to not to socially isolate themselves is super important, or have expectations that they need to do everything on their own. And when all of these pieces are put into place together, we celebrate with them, and we celebrate with them along the way. Um, I love this quote: "We delight in the beauty of the butterfly, but rarely admit the changes it has gone through to achieve that beauty." And I don't think that that can be more true of our neurodiverse kids, that there's so many changes that these kids have to go through. Um, and so many supports that they need, and so much success that needs to be celebrated, and it can be a long and hard journey, but when they get there, it's such a true celebration and a moment of joy. um, and of course, I had the quote about, you can't go back to and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending, because um, I wholeheartedly believe in that, and it's a motto that I live by, because I certainly did not get off to a great start as a parent of my son, because I just didn't understand him. And that's just, when you can understand, and you can work towards what being the parent that your child needs, and creating that foundation, it makes all the difference. And these kids who are neurodiverse, they truly are exceptional. And when we can, stop focusing so much on what they're not doing and what their disabilities are limiting themselves from doing, and we can uncover and understand the amazing strengths that they have and support them in developing the skills, they are going to be truly exceptional, because they are going to be the inventors and the creators and the out of the box thinkers and the experimenters who will change the world like so many of these other truly exceptional people did. So thank you so much for enduring this um, uh, webinar about my Stepstool model. These are the resources that um, take it back, that I use to inform this model. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you about neurodiversity, about your neurodiverse child, and the unique color of green that your child is. And I hope that this was helpful, as we get to know one another and learn how to help your child become the best version of themselves that they can be, and help you become the best parent that you can be for them. Thank you so much.